This conference will now be recorded.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. John and I have had some conversations prior to this, and I'm excited to go down that road. But if you guys have questions as we proceed, please unmute, let us know. We want to make sure this is worth your guys' time. John, one of the things we talked about and that I just alluded to was like rosters and documentation. Since that's usually what happens at the starter training, I'm going to spit that question at you right now. What kind of liability do we have with our roster and course completion documentation? How accurate does it need to be? What's the impact of those things?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you very much for ISFSI and inviting us onto the show. The construction in the background is we're doing a house remodel upstairs. In order to get upstairs, you have to start downstairs for those of you who are construction maniacs. And so, and there's nobody working today, so it's going to be pretty quiet. And I'm wearing an Aloha shirt because it's so sunny here in Washington that I had to wear something that's a little bit more festive. So the sort of the question about rosters and documentation, I think as an attorney is very important that you create a roster of those who are attending those classes. You want to make sure that in the roster it shows a beginning and an end time, and to make sure that the person who's being trained fulfills their obligation to stay and participate. And that roster should be controlled by the instructor. A lot of times you'll see clipboards at the doorway to the classroom or out on the drill ground, and people will come in, disappear, and somebody will time them out at the end of the day, indicating that they've been there for the full session of training. I think the other part that needs to be on a roster, and I've been pretty adamant about that in my own department, is that you want to make sure that the instructor's name is on there, the topic of what they're going to be teaching or what skill set they're going to evaluate, and then some objectives that either have been created by the department or as part of a county training consortium or from other source that has some validity. And a lot of that would lend itself to a good defense if a firefighter or EMS provider was injured or killed during a training event, which unfortunately happens. And we want to make sure that we minimize our liabilities to the department and make sure that documentation is completed. So the other thing we want to avoid is this sort of pencil whipping exercises that Murphy, McGruder, Anderson, Lockhart, Schaffer, all these guys that just showed up, but what did they accomplish at the end of the session? And so I think we need to combine again what your objectives are and those sorts of things. I'm a big proponent of test taking. Even in some of my classes I do up here for Officer Development Academy, I'll do a test at the end of and it's simple. It's just 10 questions. What did you learn the objectives or something that we should have done better? I throw a couple of Monty Python questions in there to see if people can think on the fly. What's the weight of an unladen sparrow, fly and that sort of stuff. And so it sort of creates this sort of learning, I think, a learning environment, and helps people be a little bit creative in their thought processes.
Also, something we do at the front of the class is like liability waivers. I work in a state training agency, so we have a lot of folks that have to supply a liability waiver, or AHJ has to sign off on their fitness for duty. And we kind of process those the same time as we do those rosters. You mentioned pencil whipping. What's our responsibility to make sure our folks are physically fit or medically fit to participate? And how's that play into medical monitoring?
That's a hell of a loaded question, Erin. I think one of the issues is, and I know that we've talked about. First of all, I think liability waivers are basically to deter any sort of litigation. It creates this sort of environment. Well, I signed the waiver, I can't sue, and we have seen on numerous occasions where that's not true. I think the waiver just makes the instructor comfortable or the institution comfortable. But if push came to shove, if there was gross negligence and those sorts of things, the waivers basically don't have any weight. And I think, the more recent one was a Disney litigation that just happened a month ago. And Disney corporate lawyer said, well, you signed a waiver for Disney programming on television that gives a blanket immunity to Disney for any event that has ever occurred in a Disney facility and resulting in an injury or death. And I'm thinking, I'm scratching my head. I said, how the hell can they bootstrap you signing a waiver for Disney programming on your television to an event that happened in a Disney park? And you can't do that. Disney withdrew that sort of ludicrous sort of defense posturing on their part. And so I think one of the issues is that we talk about medical liability. Now that could be a big issue as it deals with, say for an example, Erin, you're running a drill on the drill ground, and you have a firefighter that's obviously unfit, and so you can make that determination by, basically, I hate to say this, but weight. If you put them through some pre-training drills, are they sucking down an air bottle in 5 minutes and not the usual 15 or 20? Are they wheezing? Is their blood pressure through the ceiling? And I know that you and I chatted about taking basic vital signs, blood pressure and pulse before people go into a training exercise. And if you have somebody coming in, their blood pressure is 190 over 100, every EMT in this class today knows that, that's stroke country. And so if you stress a person out with heat and stress them doing a skill event, there's a high probability that this individual may have, a medical emergency. Now there's, and I don't want to put a blanket statement as to, anybody who's overweight is unfit, because I know that as we do our physical fitness testing annually in our department, we had some pretty large firefighters that were pretty fit. And so when you look at them, you're thinking, holy crap, they may be unhealthy, but the reality is they're very healthy. They're just big people. And so I think as the instructor, first of all, if you're going to get a waiver, you want to start out at the individual's department, make sure that they're capable of doing the training, have the fire chief or training officer in your visiting department sign a medical waiver that they are fully capable of performing whatever drill sequence they're going to be doing during the day. And then on the other side is that you as the instructor or your institution has accepted these sort of liability waivers and medical waivers from the training individual. But like I said, the waivers are pretty much only as good as the paper they're written on. And I think that, if a firefighter comes in, the waiver from his department indicating that he's medically qualified or she's medically qualified to participate, has a medical event, the responsibility, I think, goes back on the department that sent the candidate. And it's not so much you as the host department that you have a liability or a responsibility to accept the liability, right? Certainly accept the responsibility. And I think one of the things that we see, and we've seen this in training events where there's not enough safety mechanisms in place and individuals get into trouble and nobody recognizes it. And so we're thinking, this guy has respiratory distress, he's got chest pain, he's sweating profusely, or she is. Somebody needs to be, sort of the safety officer in these sort of events so they can recognize when somebody's in jeopardy and pull them out and get them treated before, a fatal event occurs.
But what about those folks that we're kind of iffy about and we return them to duty, or we have to time out them in training and then they return back to duty after that? I know that's kind of been some of the opposition I've talked to departments about when we talk about medically monitoring during training of, hey, I got minimum staffing to maintain. That's something I hear frequently. So where does that play into things when we have staffing requirements or we don't want to deal with the personnel issue of pulling somebody out because they appear to be borderline or threshold medically unfit?
That's a judgment call. I think that, you as the instructor have the control of your training ground. And so if you see somebody that's struggling, it's your obligation to pull them off and then to make a report to the agency that they came from and say, we had an event, your firefighter, we had a rehab section as part of our training. We had a safety officer. We made these observations. I think it's incumbent on the department, even on minimum staffing days, that maybe that company needs to shut down for a few hours until you get a replacement in, and so this person can go get evaluated either at a hospital or by his own physician. I think one of the things that I've seen is that we've always taken struggling candidates in training to the hospital ourselves, and so we don't let them go by themselves because sometimes they won't make it. They don't go. They say, "Well, I'll get better. I'll just go home. In a couple hours, I'm gonna hydrate. I'm gonna eat something. I'm gonna feel better." And unfortunately, those are the people that you find who are deceased as a result of this sort of either a pulmonary emboli or a cardiac arrest or some other medical event that was that our responsibility to do that? I don't think there is a legal responsibility. I think there's more of a moral responsibility to make sure that somebody who's struggling on the drill ground needs to get medical attention in a medical facility, and that's probably our obligation to make sure that happens.
And then where do we rest on documentation? Because if we are doing medical monitoring, if we are doing a patient handoff, or we're returning somebody to service or to their home agency, how much can we communicate? Because that's the other opposition I hear is, oh, HIPAA, HIPAA, HIPAA. So what can we tell people who aren't the participant? What and how should we maintain that documentation that we did some sort of medical care or medical monitoring?
Right. I think HIPAA has a defined definition of who can be privy to information, and it's basically somebody that we may treat in the field. They're turned over to a medical professional, and violations of HIPAA generally happen at the higher corporate level. I don't think there may be maybe a couple of cases out there where patient information was revealed on your social media site. The department got sued as a result of that, but most of the HIPAA stuff that we're seeing is more of at a higher level of responsibility, like corporate, like pharmacies as an example, or medical providers taking pictures of other patients in the hospital and distributing them on social media. There's a responsibility there. I think as far as when we sort of dismiss for medical reasons somebody off the drill ground and they're in distress, which is the basis of the dismissal, then I don't think there's a HIPAA liability or jeopardy if you tell the fire chief of the department saying, John Murphy was on location, he was struggling with the drills because of shortness of breath, or he was complaining of chest pain or fatigue. We took his blood pressure, it was 190 over 100. We think there's a medical issue here, and we took him to the hospital against his better judgment. And then, we're just letting you know that you have a firefighter that you may want to evaluate a little bit further down the road and get some, basically do medical clearance or get an IME, an independent medical exam from your department's doctor or a physician that actually knows what goes on in the fire service. I have to put that little credential in there, and get him cleared to come back to work, or her cleared to come back to work. I don't think there's HIPAA jeopardy there, just from my personal experience.
Okay. And then if we had folks who came into training and we did medical monitoring and we're doing a good rehab, but we still push them past that threshold because maybe our training is a little more dramatic than our normal operations are. What's the importance of the correlation of the degree of difficulty of training and the realism related to our department operations?
Well, I think we need to train realistically, but not overboard. So I think that there's this, how do we train people until they drop? That's one thought that some people have. Like, this is not boot camp, right? We've been to boot camp, we've been there, got the t-shirts, we're done with all that sort of stuff. But this is a sort of a learning environment. And yes, we probably need to stress or tax those individuals, especially if you have doing acquired structure burning, or you have a burn room where people go in and, repetitively, to do the suppression component of it. It's hot, you're sweaty, you're wearing a lot of bunker clothing, you're breathing heavy. I think the point here is that we need to sort of train like we practice. And so, fighting a fire, as one example, is strenuous. And so do we want to, get them up to the point where they need to, and I think we need to give firefighters the opportunity to be their own safety officer, saying, look, I need to take a break. And so we need to accept that um, sort of I would call it a new philosophy, is to, it's not always the drill instructor that puts people in harm's way. It's themselves. Sometimes the firefighter says, I can do it, I can do it, I can do it, till they flop over, and then they can't do it anymore. So I think there needs to be some sort of trigger point where the firefighter indicates that they're at capacity and they can't do anymore. Then our responsibility is we need to bring them out to rehab and stop the drill, create a safe environment, give great people, give them a rest, because on regular, depending on the size of your department, you may be manpower flush, or you may be manpower deficient, and so you need a lot of people to do a lot of things, and sometimes you don't always have that. A lot of departments across the country have few resources and a big job to do. And so I think we need to sort of, in our training, sort of train for that. How do we rotate crews in? How can we, rehabilitate them a little bit faster? There's a lot of technology, I think, that we see from professional athletes now that are being used on the fire ground, like cooling devices, t-shirts that have cooling components to them, chairs. So, and then, any sort of fluid rehabilitation is good. Fans, misting fans, it depends on, what part of the country that you're in. Washington today, we're 80 degrees. A fire, if you had a structure fire today, it's going to be hot. And so what are we doing in order to make, do a good rehab recovery for our firefighters? I think we need to replicate that on the training ground as well.
What are some of the popular trends in litigation that we're seeing for training instructors right now, or fire departments that training could help resolve?
How much time do you have?
Cliff notes.
I think for training, we see, I think the general litigation that we see in the fire service is discrimination and hostile work environment, retaliation, bullying, harassment, those sorts of things. When you read some of the cases of, say, for an example, probationary firefighters that are in academy, there's a number of cases coming out where the probationary firefighter, the candidate firefighter, feels that they've been bullied or harassed during a training event. And so when push comes to shove, they may have been. I think an investigation needs to occur. And most of the time, and I don't want to say this as a lawyer, but if you treat everybody equally bad, and one person says they're treating me bad, then everybody says, well, he treats us bad too. How bad is bad? So is it because I'm a woman, or is it because I'm a person of color, or is it because I'm a white guy? Am I being singled out for special treatment? And that may rise to the level of harassment or discrimination and those sorts of things. A big case down in California about 10 or 12 years ago, where a probationary candidate firefighter was in an academy and she was harassed by training staff. And so, asked out for dates, not given the same opportunity as the male candidates. She ends up filing a lawsuit against the department, wins a $3 million judgment against the department, and has never worked as a firefighter again. And although that's what her chosen career was. When we see, training events where it's not in an academy scenario, it's the same sort of situation. You get discrimination, you get harassment, you get bullying, where people are singled out in order to either set the example for others or to try to increase the status of the instructor, that this is a no BS sort of training facility, and we're going to make it as hard as we possibly can on you. And for some people, it's totally unnecessary that they have to go through this sort of harassment, right, and bullying. I think the other thing is we don't pre-plan our training events. Sometimes, even in my department, we had people come back from a training conference, and this is when we're starting to do bailouts on buildings. and we didn't have the right equipment to do it. So our training staff cobbled together this training prop, and by the time we figured out that this wasn't the right assembly of equipment, we lost 3 firefighters with shoulder separations as they were coming out the window. So we stopped, obviously. We went back to where they came from, the training conference, talked to the people that actually put that on, and found out that we missed 5 steps out of 10 steps to make a safe training environment. So, we basically wrecked 3 firefighters with shoulder tears. And then the other part is, inspecting the training ground. Years ago when I was a paramedic down in Thurston County, we had an acquired structure. We're going in and out, and one of the firefighters disappeared. And so we stopped, the operation. We did an all call for a roll call, and we found that the firefighter was in the woods taking a leak, and he fell into a septic tank and disappeared,
No.
which, which created a whole different scenario. So we stopped burning the building down, and then we did a confined space rescue, and they got credit for that drill as well. And when they found the guy, he was yelling, "Help, help, help." He was up to his armpit in septic contents. And so not only did we get a confined space rescue, we did a hazardous materials decon, which we had to strip him naked. And so the sort of the end of the story, which everything turned out okay. But I said to him, who he was my partner at the time, I said, "Geez, Rick, you're going to have to get a whole new set of bunker gear." And he goes, "They're not my bunker gear. They're your bunker gear." And so he stole my bunker gear out of the aid car, because I was this, the one of the bench riders on this drill. So he took my gear and went in and did his thing. So I got a whole new set of bunker gear, which is really cool. I think the other part is that we don't pre-plan our training sessions. And so, I know that many of you have been, as a student, you go into a scenario and you really don't have any sort of pre-knowledge of what's going on. And I know that, there's trying to add to the suspension and the mystery of the drill. But what I would like to do, what I would like to see, which I think makes a safer operation, is if you do sort of a pre-training assembly of, this is what our objectives are. This is what the training ground looks like. We've done a safety check on all the equipment that's going to be used. And you're documenting that stuff too as the training instructor. So, you inspected the training ground. There's no septic tanks in there. You've reviewed the harnesses and the safety devices if you're going to rappel out of a building. You've done all of those sort of things for this particular drill. And I would compile that with all the other documentation that you are putting together as well, and try to make the grounds as safe as possible. One of the things I like to see too, I think for just for personal safety, is that you have a safety officer, and you run whatever you're going to do by your safety officer. And I think it gets a second set of eyes, because we have a tendency to be somewhat tunnel focused. It gets a second set of eyes on your drill. It may take 10 minutes to do that, but it's well worth it at the end. And then you document again that you had your safety officer, and whoever it was, like Michael Anderson is my safety officer today. He looked at the drill. He said, "This is a good way to go," or "You need to make a change over here." And we just document that and proceed with the drill. I think for the end of this here is that we need to make sure that everybody is a safety officer. So if you go in, because we don't go in as the drill instructor necessarily we don't make entry every time. So the firefighters make entry every time. And if they see something that's not right, they need to call timeout. And so we need to say, "Look, whatever your signal is," and then reestablish and refocus what the objectives of the drill are based on observations from the people that are actually participating in that drill set.
I attended a conference in the last 3 years where a really noted instructor had a nice group of recruits, of students who were in their class, and they finished their objectives early. And so he wanted to show them how to do some bailouts. So he went to the second story, and he was showing them a bicep bailout, where the rope came around the bicep and the forearm, and he took the tail around his waist and rappelled basically down that way, completely unscripted. And his words of wisdom was, "You won't have a belay in real life, so don't practice with a belay. Just practice from heights that won't kill you." So at what point does liability become neglect or criminal neglect, or how can perceived enhancements to training become bigger legal issues?
I kind of laugh at that because I've had an instructor do that once because he tore his bicep as a result of doing that. So I think that if you're ad-libbing and off script your training, I think it creates a greater negligence claim for other firefighters to may get injured on the job. Sometimes departments say, well, this is part of your job. Your training officer is teaching you how to do this sort of emergency bailout with a sort of jury rig system, which you're the belayer, right? You're using friction on your arm and doing like the Austrian whatever rappel. It creates, I think, a liability on the organization if somebody gets hurt. First of all, you're going to put somebody out of service. So if you tear a bicep, and any of you have ever torn your biceps, you know that it's at least 3-month healing process after surgery, or even in therapy and recovery. So you're essentially out of service for that period of time. That creates, I think, a labor and industries investigation in many states that will come in and take a look at your practices and how many people have been injured and that sort of stuff. And there's a liability on the department because you may get fined by OSHA, or here in the state of Washington, it's WISHA. So it's the same investigative arm. So we've had departments that got fined, several $100,000 as a result of negligence on the training ground. And and I think that if you're going to be doing that sort of stuff, I would go back to the classroom and just take a breather, have the people hydrate, talk about the drill and all of its shortcomings. And I know that in an emergency situation and you need to bail out, you don't have all the harnesses and the belts and that sort of stuff, which I think should be a part of your standard operating package for individuals. And we need to practice the emergency sort of stuff with safety equipment on, and not do not do that sort of bailout with a rope. Some departments will do a bailout with hose. There's established procedures for doing that. Some people do bailouts with ladders. They slide head first down the ladder. That comes with its own set of fractures and injuries. So if you're going to do that, you need to make sure that it's a methodical training process and people don't get injured, and there's sufficient safety mechanisms in place to create a safe drill. On the fire ground, and I think on a training ground, going back to the training ground, we're trying to create muscle memory. And so when you're in an emergent situation, that sort of flight or fight reflex comes in, and we head to the window and we're bailing out. Hopefully there's something out there that we can grab a hold of and slide down the side of the building, which may not be already readily available. So muscle memory, don't do stupid things. I had, when I was in an academy, when I worked at a department in Tacoma, we had a couple of special forces guys that were like insane. And instead of rappelling down the side of the building, they just jumped out of the 3rd-story window, and both of them broke their legs. So they're out of commission. We thought it was very impressive, but pretty stupid. So, and the drill instructor got into trouble for, these guys sort of taking their own way out of the building.
So what grounds does the instructor have in that? Can they claim like qualified immunity? Can they say not my liability, a waiver was signed? Where's the instructor go after stupidity?
Goes to the back of the class. And I think the sort of the waiver. So we do have a qualified immunity. I think anybody in public service and across the United States has a qualified immunity to ordinary negligence. If you go out of your way and intentionally harm someone, then that immunity can be waived. Waivers, like I said before, I think make the instructor and the department more comfortable. The reality is that people, if there's an enterprising attorney gets involved and knows what they're doing, they can figure out that there is gross negligence here, and there's a basis of a lawsuit. Sometimes if there's and we don't see this very often. I think the only case that we ever saw was in New York, in Lairdsville, New York, where they had a training officer, assistant chief, ended up getting criminally charged for a firefighter's death. and 2 injuries as a result of just a whole botched acquired structure drill. And I don't think I don't, as I remember correctly, he didn't really serve time, but he got sentenced. And then I think the sentence got um, deferred, but the department that he was in was sued by the family of the deceased firefighter, and they went out of business. And so many departments in New York, as an example, are 501c3s, and they're a business, and so they were basically sued out of existence. And that's the Lairdsville, New York case, and I can't remember what year it was, but it was significant in the
Uh,
fact that this was an individual who was a fire officer, training officer, uh, faced criminal charges.
yeah, that was, I think it was September 21st, 2001. We use that as a case study.
Oh, good. Okay.
But that was one where it really draws attention to the IIC, that the need to be in compliance with 1403. We had a question earlier on in the chat box. Dave Roberts asked, can you share insights regarding live fire burn liabilities? And if an incident occurs, does 1403 come into play?
Yes. So, speaking on behalf of ISFSI and their 1403 training, I think I think the Lairdsville case really brought the 1403 standard to light. I think a lot of departments were kind of running live acquired structure training based on prior experience. 1403 came out. It's got some excellent standard that we need to apply to live training fires. And so Lairdsville just said, they used the 1403 standard as the basis. I think part of the litigation. You didn't follow the standard. You didn't have the safety, all the elements in 1403. I think today, being that ISFSI and other institutions are teaching the 1403 standard, it may be negligent on your part to do a live fire training without people that are, certified in the 1403 standard to be live fire instructors. Again, that takes a lot of horsepower from the attorney to figure that out, and where did they fail, who wasn't certified to be the instructor. And I think if you take the class, it sort of waives a lot of those potential liabilities, and for sure it makes it for a safer training event for your firefighters.
I've worked in state training for 10 years now, 10 plus years. In my current role, we do ISFSI Pro Board certification. In my prior role, we did competency training, preparing students for that certification from another agency. So I always like to hear that you mentioned certified to 1403. What's the importance of being certified versus having competency, and who can designate that you have competency in your experience?
Wow. Let's see, how about 14,000 uninjured firefighters determine your competency as an instructor? Again, it's the competency issue is that sort of what's the high bar? Who determines competency? What is competency? And are you, did you achieve that? And that's sort of, you're grasping at fog, I think, in a lot of those competency issues. I think the certification part puts a hard document in place that says, John Murphy went through this training, he received a certification, he's theoretically competent to conduct this drill. The real test comes is when you conduct the drill, are you competent enough to, make sure that your firefighters don't become injured? And I think that's the sort of the proof in the pudding. Even though you may have a certificate, you may not be all that competent. And so that's again, another determination that will be made by, either a trial or inquiries or investigations, that sort of stuff. So
I'm going to pull the scab on that a little bit, split hairs just a little. I appreciate your answer, but our certifications, ISFSI Pro Board, they only certify to what we call the process standards, 1001, 1041, 1021, those kind of things, or excuse me, the ProQual standards. They don't certify to the process standards, specifically 1403, 1582 on rehab, those kind of things. Is it just experience and not killing somebody that says we're competent in the processes? Or
well, not killing or injuring your firefighters in a drill. It's a good competent skill to have.
Yeah.
It's difficult to say. I think it's this sort of the question that can only be answered when an event occurs. and then somebody makes the determination of competency in spite of the fact that you may or may not have these certifications or these qualifications.
Okay.
So it's an event by event thing. I don't think we can blanket the whole industry by saying, this is one thing we need to do. We need to do many things.
Mhm.
That's a lawyer answer. That's like a depends answer.
I like that. Very, very good. I think that's what our audience signed up for today. So, Emily, I saw you unmute. Did you have a question, Emily, or did you want to interject?
Well, I am just interjecting because there was another question in the chat from Amanda. She said, I know this will be very dependent on state labor laws, but can we also touch on junior firefighters and training liability? Good question.
We can. Let me think about that for a second. Because I think the only place that I know of that has, and I may be wrong about this, but that sort of classifies firefighters as junior firefighters is New York, and I probably am wrong on that. We don't have what we classify as junior firefighters out here, and so what defines a junior firefighter is usually somebody under the certain age limit, so 16 I think to 18, or maybe a little bit younger, and so I think we need to ensure that first of all the junior firefighter, and let me establish the age range of 14 to 18 as an example. So what's the liability of bringing young firefighters into an organization and then having them achieve a standard such as wearing SCBA gear or doing fire suppression or roof operations or rescue and that sort of stuff. And I think that as I remember back to my New York experience, they're very limited in what they can do, right? So it's a little bit of fire gun operations. It's probably rehab. It's that sort of stuff that gets them close to the fire, but doesn't get them into the fire or into the rescue side. So it's mostly support. And as they get older and age out of the junior fire programs, and then they can do more by participating in actual live fire training or real fires, right, or real rescue events. I think the other issue is that some of the labor laws in some of the states may preclude certain individuals under a certain age from participating in what's classified as dangerous operations. And so those states need to check with your state law and OSHA to determine, if I bring somebody in who's 15, are they qualified to participate in certain fire department activities, or do I need to wait until they're 16 or 17 and not violate, the child labor and dangerous occupation labels, I think, in these states. But I'm not sure I answered the question. Ask, what state is she from? What state?
I don't know off the top of my head, but Amanda, if you want to chime in the chat.
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania.
Yeah, see that. Okay.
Perfect.
I don't know anything about Pennsylvania. Went to school there once, but they kicked me out. So.
Well, we have another question, and I'm just going in order here from Troy. He said, if we train them how we work, shouldn't we rehab how we work? Do we have a requirement to take care of our people before they have an issue?
The answer is yes. That's an excellent question. So I think we need to train like we practice. So if you're doing strenuous training activities, that you need to set up a rehab group. And so under the NFPA standard and whatever that is, I think that some departments can't mount. It may be one person. It may be an EMT, it may be a paramedic, or maybe like a junior firefighter that's running rehab. But I think we need to pre-plan that sort of stuff from the 1584 standard. Thank you, Erin. That talks about rehab and how you set that whole operation up, because when you're in the heat of the battle and all of a sudden your firefighters coming out after 1 or 2 air bottles, they need a place to go. They can't go back into the fire. They need to get rehabbed. And so I think pre-training on our rehabilitation and rehab units are imperative. And it also puts up I think a good practice. For an example, if you had a large fire like one year we had a large brush fire out here. It wasn't quite a wildland fire, but it was very intensive. And so we set up a rehab unit, and then we have a Costco that's in town, and somehow they discovered that we needed water for the firefighters that were operating on location, and this was a big fire out in our neighboring community, and all of a sudden a semi truck shows up from Costco full of water, and we go, where the heck did this come from? And somebody said, well, somebody at Costco heard there was a large fire out here, so we just did this sort of charity thing. And I think that it gives us an opportunity when in a training event to understand the logistical component of what it takes to do a rehab unit. So is it fluids? Is it food? Is it medical care? Is it cooling? Is it bottle changes? Taking blood pressures, those sorts of things. So in a training event, I think practicing the rehabilitation component is extremely important, not only to the drill itself, but if you're out on a working fire or working event, and it's going to be hours, then you're going to have to rehabilitate, rehab, and fluid challenge your participants.
Well, thank you for that, John. One last question that I see so far is from David. He said, what is the liability of the instructor in charge?
I'll give you the lawyer answer. It depends. It depends what the issue is. I think the instructor in charge is always liable for any sort of training ground operations. And again, I think it's incumbent that it is a leadership position, that's for sure. And if you have other trainers that are working with you, you're at the top of the pile. So, but the question is, does more liability rest on your shoulders than it does your associate trainers? And it really doesn't. I think that sort of responsibility is spread out between, the 3 or 4 or the 2 of you. But you are in charge. And if you created a situation where you basically instructed your associate trainers to do something that's inherently dangerous or unhealthy, and somebody gets injured or dies as a result of that, the overall liability rests with you. I think that people need to understand too that there's a term called vicarious liability, where your department actually is the legal has the legal responsibility for your actions, unless you're grossly negligent. And sometimes the department gets excused from the lawsuit, and it's all on you. And so, just statistically, very rarely do we see individuals get sued, like me or you or the audience, because we don't have anything, right? We have very little money, probably no savings. If there's a $2 or $3 million award, they're going to come after John Murphy, and they're going to get like $1. And so they're going to go after your department. Your department is the one with the money. And so, thankfully, the vicarious liability concept brings your department into the mix, and then and they're on the hook. You're a witness, of course, and your department generally has an obligation to defend you. But my advice is, if you're going to get sued as a result of actions on the training ground, and the assumption is your department's going to defend you, I'd still get a lawyer just to protect your interests. Because the department may just throw you to the wolves, right? The department said, well, Murphy was the head training officer. He screwed up really bad. There's gross negligence here. We're distancing ourselves from his actions.
So John, that kind of gives me a couple questions. We talk in a sense of criminal. Does that still make us culpable to civil claims? And kind of on the thread of what you're talking about, of vicarious immunity or vicarious liability, I talked to a training officer recently whose department's had some trouble with promotional exams being contested, to the extent that he's gone and gotten a personal insurance protection for himself, because he expects before the end of the year, with their current cadence, that he's going to get named in a suit as well. So, two different questions there of what's our susceptibility as a training personnel to civil claims, and where do we stand on promotional processes and stuff of that nature in our testing?
All right, I'm going to go back to O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson had 2 cases against him. One was prosecutorial case for a criminal act, which he got exonerated from. And then the second one was from a civil complaint from the persons that he allegedly murdered. And so there was a large award on the civil side, and nothing happened on the criminal side. And so I think that usually in criminal cases, the local prosecutor will do an investigation if there's a death. Usually a death on the fire ground incorporates, a coroner's investigation, police investigation, department investigation. So all that investigative material goes to the local prosecutor. If the prosecutor decides to file charges, then it becomes, the criminal side of it. Regardless of whether you win or lose, you can still be sued civilly by the surviving firefighter's family or the firefighter if they survive. So you're sort of in, legal jeopardy either way. I think what was the second part of your question?
So the second part is a training officer of a larger department. They have a history of having their promotional exams overturned or lawsuits for every promotional exam, to the extent that this training officer has spent personal funds to get a personal insurance policy, expecting to be involved in lawsuits.
Yeah, my advice is I wouldn't spend any extra money on litigation unless you fear a lawsuit as a result of your actions as somebody who's sort of a high profile person in the organization. In general, I think that if you're starting your own training agency, you should have insurance. There's you're the person that's going to be hit up for a liability, and you need to have, some pretty good errors and omission insurance from your insurance company. And, I think that's an individual choice on the part of the training officer, because promotional exams are fraught with challenges, right? There's, I think the good case right now is Frank Ricci in New Jersey, a Supreme Court decision where the promotional test didn't meet whatever the imaginary standard of the city council was, and they threw it all out. So it basically disrupted, promotions for Hispanics, African Americans, white guys. And so Frank, who's Caucasian, and anybody knows who Frank is, basically filed a lawsuit, and they won a Supreme Court decision that said that was totally wrong. And then there were sequela legal cases afterwards for all the other people that didn't get promoted either, in addition to Frank. So I think, the promotional process needs to be pretty much ironclad. You can hire out to have people do the promotion. You can hire within to have your own staff do promotions. But you got to make sure that you eliminate all the bias and the discrimination that may occur during the promotional process. And I think that there's lots of ways to do that. It takes a lot of research to conduct a valid promotional exercise. And yeah, you're going to get challenged. I mean, some people just don't get promoted, right? I would, not like in one of my departments, and I won't mention which one, but the fire chief had the rule of 300, right? So instead of the labor group rule of 3, you have to, promote one of the top 3 persons. He could promote anyone he wanted to. And he pissed off a lot of people in our department because he just refused to promote people that were qualified. But nobody filed a lawsuit. It's just that's the way he was, and that's just the way the department operated. And, why would I file a lawsuit? Because it's not going to go anywhere, and I'm going to have to spend a lot of money out of my own pocket in order, to promote the litigation against the fire chief. So after the fire chief retired, all of these guys that didn't get promoted got promoted because they're highly qualified, but he just had a bias towards them all. And it wasn't because of color or gender. He just hated people. So he promoted very few, except his favorite.
So that goes back to your aforementioned reference to be mean to everyone equally. What was that quote?
Right. I hate you all, so you can't discriminate. I'm not discriminating against anybody. That's not the lawyer's opinion. That's just people. We have personalities out there that will do that. But I think that And the other thing too is you want to make sure that your liability insurance is not excessive. So people generally sue to the limits of your policy. And so if you have a $500,000 policy and you got nothing else, they're going to sue you for 500,000. You got a million or 3 million, they're going to go for the max. So if you feel like you need to be insulated against any sort of potential liability, I'd get sort of the minimum coverage, 250 to 500 or 500 to a million. And those policies, to my understanding, are relatively inexpensive, and you used to be able to carry them on your homeowner's policy, but I'm not sure that that's possible anymore.
So say we're doing everything right. We're pre-planning our trainings, we're maintaining our rosters, we're accurately reporting who meets our competencies defined by our objectives. We're, providing rehab, we're medically monitoring, we're creating that psychologically safe environment. We kind of joke about hate everyone equally. But say we're doing everything right and somebody comes at us with a claim of constructing a hostile work environment or down that HR path of constructive discharge. Does insurance cover us? Is there
Probably
any
not.
policy that covers that?
I don't know. I'd have to give you the other lawyer answer is I don't know.
Mhm.
I think for those sort of hostile work environments is more could be a federal claim, which your insurance is not going to cover. And the department may not cover it either, depending on what the investigation shows. So a lot of those things could turn into a federal discrimination claim, harassment, bullying, those sorts of things can be discriminatory based on your protected class in your class. And even so the protected classes, basically are gender, race, and white males over the age of 40, people that have certain religious beliefs. There's a litany of who's in the protected class. And so I think that, and we're not seeing this, but we're beginning to see this, is that we're seeing that sometimes people are easily offended by what goes on in the fire service because we have this sort of traditional, my way or the highway sort of thing. And so, and it doesn't always fit, the sort of the model of the newer employee that we're trying to recruit into our organization. So I think, we need to be sensitive to people's needs, but we also need to accomplish the mission of training, which is, to prevent, injury and death, not only to our employees, but to the general population. And we're trying to create an environment that's, fun and educational, but stressful, right? So being a firefighter or an EMT is a stressful occupation, and there's a lot that goes on in there that we need to prepare our members to realize and to sort of respond to. I think the other part of this thing is, there's a big issue with behavioral health issues and mental wellness that goes on in our institution. And the best place to start that is an academy, first of all. And then the second best place is when we're doing training on the drill ground. Sometimes people are freaked out by facing actual fire because they've had a bad experience. And so, as an instructor, do we know that? That's the one thing. And should we listen to other people like, old Murphy's scared witless of going into a fire because, his buddy got all burned up 10 years ago, or, he suffered an injury that, took him out of being a firefighter for, 6 or 7 months. And so there's this sort of, we need to recognize the fact that there are people that do have mental blocks against, facing life-threatening situations, and we don't want to be on the backside of that person pushing them into the building, saying, "Get your butt in there to do this sort of training event," and recognizing the fact that we have other issues to resolve, and a lot of us are not that astute to figure that out. It may need somebody to come to tell you, or you need to sort of self-reflect on how come old Murphy was reluctant to go into the house burn, recognizing the fact that you don't know me. That's the first thing. I may be new to your department, but I came from another department, and I had a horrible event and a horrible experience in that department, and I'm scared. So we need to recognize that sort of stuff too. Not everybody's macho man, that will go in to do that. So
And we are going to create stressful situations, and hopefully we're going to stress inoculate, not just stress inundate our folks.
Right.
But at some point, somebody's going to think we're jerky, being a jerk or being rude, and being a jerk, thankfully, is not a criminal charge.
Not yet.
But I mean, at what point as instructors should we be worried? Are we free and clear until we create disparate treatment? What is disparate treatment?
Well, I want to go back to the stress inoculation that you talked about. I think that the common citizen in your community looks at you like you're a crazy person when you go running into a house fire, right, or get into sail into harm's way, and they're probably scratching their head wondering if there's something wrong with that person to go do that. And I think in the training department, we inoculate our firefighters as to what real true danger is, right? So we kind of create the scenarios that I'm in charge, I control my destiny. I have the tools and the training in order to make sure that I get out of here safely. I think the other part of that issue is that at some point, I think the organizations that these people originate from or from your own organizations need to set up a pathway for people to talk without repercussions or people saying, well, they're mentally weak. They shouldn't be a firefighter. And I think we are way beyond that now with the number of, suicide events that we have in our profession and the advent of mental health professionals, chaplains, peer counselors in your organization. They all should play a role in, in training, right? To make sure that when we do stress people out, some people get really stressed out and they freeze, right? I think that's one of the things. If you're pushing me into a building and all of a sudden I'm pushing back, there's something going on with old John Murphy. So we need to figure that all out. And so ask the question without yelling at me, what's happening? We'll take you out of the drill evolution, put you over in rehab, and we'll come, let you rest for a while, and then we can say, hey, we're here to talk. What's going on? Because we noticed that you were reluctant to go into the burn room. So, and I'm going to say, screw you. You don't need to know anything. And but make the pathways available for people, to sort of express their fears and some of their mental challenges. And again, we're not asking instructors to be counselors. Some of you may be. We're asking you to just be observant and sensitive to people, how people respond to stressful situations, and that's, I think, the best that we can do.
I have a quote. I stole it from Alana Brunacini, the granddaughter of Alan, and her guidances were to recognize and refer. And so we're not mental health treatment professionals. Our job is recognize and refer.
Right.
So I really appreciate that guidance of a litmus test.
Good advice.
So
the man who created Mrs. Smith.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Emily, I know we're coming up close to time. How much time do we have? Do we have time to take any more questions from the audience if anybody has any?
Yeah, feel free, anyone, to shoot their last minute questions into the chat. It's about 4:58, 4:59 my time, but of course we can answer any questions anyone has.
Okay.
So now's the time to do it. We can give everyone a moment if anyone has any.
Yeah, and I want to go back because I asked earlier, and you started talking about psychological safety, John. So I'm going to try to fill a little time while we wait for any trailing questions. Of a term I've learned in the last couple of years is disparate treatment, and I'm not for sure I understand it correctly. So could you explain your take of that term? Of what is it? Why should we worry about it?
It's just, treating people differently, right? So disparate treatment is I think, an issue that we see that in promotional processes. We see that in opportunities in the organization where, you have an opportunity that may present itself in an organization, and you basically, as the leader, decide that, the Caucasian guy gets it over the black woman. And so the question is, have I been treated differently as I've been treated? Am I suffering from a disparate treatment, which is different treatment for people in an organization based on maybe a bias that you may have. And so I think one of the issues that we need to recognize is equal opportunity. I can get on my DEI bandstand right here. I think we need to provide equal opportunity for people that are qualified to do the job. And sometimes we may not have enough qualified people in an organization to do the job. And again, that's incumbent on leadership, to provide that opportunity for people to become qualified uh, equitably or equally.
Thank you. We do have a chat box submission. We have stress inoculation or stress in training. What creates stress on an emergency scene? Isn't stress created by unforeseen or unknown events that you are struggling to manage? If your personnel are trained over and over and over until we see what we see as routine has an ever-evolving bar of competency, doesn't the fireground stress reduce as a direct result? After 38 years, I found my tendencies to create false stress has almost entirely disappeared. Are we not better served to train them to handle the issue rather than train them to be run in circles and yelled at?
Run in circles, scream and shout.
Yeah, that superficial stress that we see a lot of training folks create.
Yeah, I think that we're in an inherently stressful profession, right? We see lots of things that other people don't see. We do lots of things that other people don't do. And I think as a training officer, it's incumbent on us to present as much, um, experiences that we could possibly face in our career, learning from personal experience, reading the books and magazines, looking at other training institutions and other events that may have occurred, in other parts of the country. I think we can't train to every possible scenario that the firefighter is going to be facing, but we need to train to put tools in the toolbox that individuals can pull out and then apply to a certain situation that they may have never seen before, right? And so, I'd use the example, and from my personal experience, that when I worked in Lakewood, we used to respond to Stillicum, which had a paper plant and a large chipper to produce pulp. And one of our rescue calls was an individual who fell into the chipper and was not completely consumed, but a lot of that person was up in the pile, right? So that was stressful to start with because the person was still alive. And so we had to sort of creatively think out of the box about how we're going to tamponade off the bleeding. Do we need to bring a surgeon out here to do an amputation? And how are we going to get the guy out of the chipper? And so we had the mechanics from the plant start to pull the chipper assembly apart. We had a doctor that was coming in a state trooper's car with a surgical team to do some amputations. And then we had, this was years ago before blood was even, even talked about in the EMS field, that they brought whole blood with them in order to replace the blood that he lost. He ended up dying from septic shock as 2 or 3 days later, but that was a situation you can't train for, right? But I think we had enough training and knowledge skills that we had a patient in an unusual situation and we need to sort of be creative and to mitigate this particular medical emergency. And I think, when it all was said and done and we did the sort of the tailboard wash, that everybody did great. I mean, all the services responded. All the people that were on location were competent. They were methodical. They set up an incident command system. So they did everything that they were supposed to do. The outcome was successful, preliminarily. And so, we thought we did a pretty good job. And so, some wise ass in our next training class says, "Are we going to do that chipper drill again?" We said, "No, that's not a possibility." So, but we had the tools to do it. And I think as a training officer, it's incumbent on us to make sure that your firefighters have the tools to address, unusual situations.
That reminds me of a quote. One of my favorite quotes I try to share with my students, but I'm sure I butcher it every time, is that basic students want to do intermediate skills want to do advanced skills, and advanced students know that that advanced work is just the basics executed perfectly. And so it kind of plays into this question as well of, you know, how much stress do we have to artificially generate, or can we create confidence in our folks by just, teaching them the basics and executing that flawlessly, and to the degree that they can call those audibles and combine them when they have a chipper drill, if you will. Because that doesn't sound like one I would want to run twice.
No, I think it's one time and is a lifetime. No, and again, I think you're right. I think the stress we put on people is because we may not educate them well enough in order to accomplish, the goals of whatever your drill is. And so that creates internal stress. I think the other part is that some people may not have the confidence to complete the drill, and that creates its own stress. And I think much of that has to do with how we go about the training sessions. And so, we're building skill builds confidence, and the confidence should reduce the stress. I think we're always in a stressful environment, and some people perform very well under stressful environments. Some people just collapse under a stressful environment because they freeze. They can't think. It's the flight or fight reaction, the lizard brain, as some people calls it. You can't do anything. You're just sort of paralyzed because of the stress that goes on. As training, our job is to eliminate a lot of that stuff by confidence building in, how we approach the drill, how we approach people that are in our classes, and giving them the confidence that they can do pretty much anything. If somebody has a question, I don't think I can do this. It's up to us to say, well, let's see what you can do, and then we'll build on your base information in order to make you, more competent and more confident that you can actually do this stuff. And if you face a situation you've never seen before, you need to just sit for a second and think about how you're going to approach it, and then proceed forward confidently. And I think that sometimes we do things confidently, and the outcomes are horrible, right? And so it's our job again to go back and sort of evaluate what went right and what went wrong, and then try to replicate that, other than the chipper drill, on the fire ground.
I'm going to keep that chipper drill in my lexicon now.
I don't want to see that in the newspaper.
So I have a question. We talked earlier about how much should training match operations, and we talked about that being closely aligned. But what about when we start in training seeing operational deficiencies? For instance, over time, a training department has, and I'm not thinking of anything in particular, so don't read into that. But over time, a training department has a department has deficiencies in training, and so their operational capacity is diminished, where the training folks know, man, not a person in the department should be making entry anywhere. But the ops chief is still, to Valhalla, we search every structure, and we've got that lack of alignment and perceived capacity or capabilities and realized capabilities. When and where does that become a legal issue? What's the training groups or the training person's options? Is it just communicate, document, and hope no one dies? Or in this case, how can the tail wag the dog to make sure that we have positive outcomes?
I think somebody in training division needs to have the capacity to speak truth to power. And so sometimes we're reluctant to talk to the fire chief about the differences between your operational capacity and your training capacity. And there needs to be alignment in there for sure. It's sort of a tough road to go down, where you're seeing, you're trying to produce the best firefighter you can, either through an academy or through ongoing training. And the departments, the deficiency in operations or their aggressiveness in fighting fire doesn't meet what we're trying to train over here. And so there needs to be an alignment between your divisions as it deals with, what's the department's expectation of what our firefighters do, and then how can training meet that. I think one of the things that we need to maybe do is maybe the fire chief doesn't have confidence in the firefighters and doesn't believe that they can do, the job that they've been hired or trained to do. And And our obligation, I think, in training is to demonstrate the effectiveness of the firefighters when it comes to making certain evolutions, doing fire suppression or rescue or trench rescue, those sort of specialties. And the other thing is, there's so many fire chiefs that sit in their office all day and never get out on the fire ground. And so I used to invite our fire chief out all the time, the guy that hated everybody. And so and he would like come once in the 4 years before he retired after I got there. And I said, you can't be sitting up here on the second story and then hearing all the stuff that goes down on the drill ground or in the training room and not come down and participate, because you're old. That's the one thing. You're a volunteer firefighter and now you're a chief of a career department, and I think it's incumbent on you as the fire chief to get involved in the department. And he threatened to fire me. That was his first response, and his second response was, "I'll think about it." And I asked him, I said, well, are you going to fire me now? He goes, well, not yet. And so he says, I'm just waiting for you to come back up here and get in my face about what I should be doing, what my job should be. So I successfully survived that onslaught. And he got down there once and he was pretty impressed, about the firefighters. And so when we had an alarm, working fire, I'd go grab him out of his office, throw him in my car, take him out to the fire. And I said, just sit here and watch. So these guys can do the job. So for him, it was a transition because to be honest with you, he was never really a firefighter per se. He was basically a store manager that got hired by the department, which, he had good accounting skills, but, personnel skills were horrible and sort of the suppression skills were non-existent. So we tried to get him sort of steeped into your department. Your department can do the job. And I think that's, that sort of truth to power matrix that is tough for a lot of people to talk about it. So
We've rubbed against HR issues a couple times here, and we've talked about instructors' documentation of lesson plans and rosters and assessments and those kind of things. What about informal documentation? One of the recommendations I've always heard over the years, and I've lightly practiced, is when you start doing stuff, have your side log of what did we do today, notes that might help you if something goes to litigation, the informal documentation in your possession, time, date stamped. Because if something goes to litigation, it'll be years from now, and you may not memorize that incident or remember that incident. So what should we do as should we do informal documentation? Kind of what should that look like? And on top of that, is it effective?
So the general strategy on keeping book on somebody is pretty illegal. So you can take notes. If you do like evaluations, some departments do annual evaluations under firefighters. Some officers do, side notes, just to kind of day-to-day sort of stuff. Those need to be sort of data dumped onto their evaluation on an annual basis, and you get rid of that sort of that written memory on your part. The question comes in is if there's an issue going on 2 or 3 years down the road, can I pull that material out of my record storage and then use it to say, so and so is on this date did this, on this date did that, and I think that's been proven to be not a legality and not a valid documentation and has basically been disregarded. So if you're gonna if you have notes that you're keeping on performance, not only on the fire ground but on the shift, those need to be in some sort of annual evaluation if you do annual evaluations, and disclosed. And because you don't want bad habits to continue on, because sometimes bad habits cause liability when somebody gets injured or dies as a result of you knew what was going on, you could have corrected it, you chose not to, you're going to use it against this person at some point. And so it creates that sort of liability on the department that you knew, but you failed to do anything about it, and somebody was injured or died as a result of that failure. So just, I would disclose all the time.
And not something like specifically targeted towards one person or somebody's performance, but if you have that issue where you're trying to talk truth to power, or for instance, you just keep an informal shift log, time, date, and place, these people at this place, these were the kind of calls we ran, that kind of thing. I've heard that recommended to a lot of officer folks, but
Yeah, there's a lot of departments that do shift logs, and I know that we probably in my old department have like an attic full of books up there that we do shift logs, and it's sort of repletes the history of your organization since the Civil War, until today, and the weight of those books are pretty immense. Now it's all electronic, right? So your station logs are mostly an electronic record keeping mechanism, which I think is okay. I don't think there's any issues or legal issues that would prevent somebody from doing a daily log. But if there's issues, the issues need to get addressed. So if there's a discipline issue, there's an absent issue, there's a somebody comes in intoxicated issue. I mean, those things need to be addressed immediately and not held sort of in reserve, like we're going to get this person to try to get them out of the department. So take care of that stuff right away. But documenting that stuff is certainly a valid point, and it could be used in a defense, saying, we noticed there was some issues going on in a training event or these sorts of things, and this is the remedial component of how we try to address that particular issue, especially when it comes to you weren't successful in changing behavior, the skill set didn't get any better, and so now you need to make a decision on whether you're going to retain the person, whether he's promoted, whether you can promote him or not. I mean, there's a lot of different scenarios you can use the documentation for, but they need to know about it, right? You just can't, it can't be like, surprise, we're not going to promote you because you're not competent.
I greatly appreciate that delineation. Absolutely. Is there anything I haven't asked you yet that, for the good of the order, you were expecting to say today, or that has come up and the moment to say it has passed? Anything you want to leave on the table?
Well, every question you asked me today was a surprise. So, no, you didn't. Erin and I basically had a meeting on Sunday, and we just talked about what we're going to talk about. So she said she's going to talk about these things, and she did. I think one of the things that I want to say is that training should be educational and fun. When we go to seminars or conferences and stuff like that, we want to be both entertained and educated. And so I think as a training officer, we need to kind of do both, right? So when we listen to Gordon Graham, who's probably one of the funniest speakers I know besides me and Erin, he's funny as hell. You're laughing, but you're learning something, right? And so I think for us as educators, we need to figure out what the balance is. So, and the other thing too is that we need to start to create this sort of muscle memory of people remembering certain skill sets that we think is important for your organization. So when you talk about training, like the high risk, low event, low response, so how many building collapses do we go on, and especially a small community? But in my neighboring city, they had a building that was over there for probably 100 years, and it collapsed. And so the department has never been on a building collapse before. Fortunately, it was abandoned, but no buildings are abandoned today. So they had to do a complete search in the building to look for people that are homeless. Didn't find anybody, but that was a stretch for that organization because what building in Enumclaw, Washington ever collapsed? And the answer is none until yesterday. And so that's that sort of stressful event. So I think to train people either in a classroom or in a field to sort of adapt and overcome is important for us as training. And I think the other part is we don't I don't think we put litigation and training into the same sentence because we don't think about litigations. We think about training, making sure the firefighters don't get hurt or critically injured as a result of it. We try to forecast and pre-plan training events to eliminate sort of the hazards, and then the hazards are going to be there. People fall down. I know that there's a couple of, I think last year or the year before, in a training event in a controlled environment on a training ground, a firefighter paramedic trainee was blown off the second story or third story of a training tower with an open coupling. got charged all of a sudden. He was standing in the way, and it caught him in the chest, and over the side he goes, and he expired as a result of it. Totally unanticipated, right? I mean, totally unanticipated. So it was unfortunate. And the investigation showed it was one of these events that were not projected to even ever occur, but it occurred. And so we need to think about, those sort of possibilities. What can possibly go wrong? And try to eliminate all those particular hazards to create a safe environment. It's dangerous enough out in the real world out there, and so we don't want to create a scenario where we're injuring or killing our firefighters on the training ground. So.
I think that's perfectly stated. That's awesome. So many folks want to make training so artificially stressful and risky, or not artificially stressful or risky, like genuine stressful and risky, and that makes difficult learning scenarios. So
Yeah.
Beautifully stated, and
Well,
thank you for your patience while I mutilated it.
no, you did fine. But again, I think we do need, other than the bread and butter stuff we do on the training ground, we need to do something that's maybe a little extraordinary, maybe something that you saw in one of the journals or periodicals that come out, out of real call, right? And so I think the event of the construction equipment fire and the tire blew, killed the firefighter, injured a few more. I think we just need to be, the fire ground situational awareness is really important. Like things under pressure, under heat will explode. And so did the firefighter know that? Did the command officer understand that, these gigantic tires, have a tendency to overheat, expand, and blow up and, injured or kill your firefighters? Probably not even in the memory bank, but now we know, right? Now we have an experience, unfortunately. And I think as we become more involved in lots of these different scenarios, we get smarter every day.
Hopefully. We sometimes get accidentally successful or accidentally unsuccessful, and we, argue for our limitations, I find. So
We're
what's,
just,
oh, go ahead.
no, nothing.
I was going to say there's that fool me once, and the argument that I often hear that, oh, well, firefighting is inherently dangerous. So what we do in training has to be inherently dangerous. And when we do have those negative outcomes, I think some folks in criminal cases have tried to make that argument of, oh, well, this is the cost of doing business. Have you ever seen that justification hold up?
Never. It's not the cost of doing business. I think it's the lack of planning and forethought on our part that we didn't think of every possible scenario that could occur on the training ground. And unfortunately, somebody was injured or died as a result of that. So, yes, it is an inherently dangerous business, but that's not a defense.
Mm-hmm.
Cool stuff. Well, this has been a great discussion so far. May have been the happiest of happy hours. I think we need a part 2 in the future.
Yeah,
Seriously. Thank you, Erin and John, for your time today. And thank you to all of our attendees and their participation and great questions. This will be recorded and put on YouTube. So once that is made available, I'll put a blurb in the community and let everyone know to go watch it. Other than that, I thank you again for everyone's time. And I will see you all next time on the next happy hour, which I believe is November, first Wednesday of November. And then we also have a live webinar on Monday, September 23rd on measuring operational performance. So thank you again, everyone. And feel free to reach out, in the meantime, if you do have any other questions, and I can always bug Erin or John in the future for a part 2.
Yeah, I'm one of the things is that I'm a legal counsel for ISFSI, I think, still. So I'm available to answer questions. I don't charge a lot of money for that, if any. But if I do see you at FDIC, you owe me a beer for any sort of legal questions that I do answer. And I'll hunt you down if you don't come to me first.
Deal.
And I am, just for a cheap plug on my own, I did get selected to FDIC next year in April, and I'm going to do a class on training officer liabilities. So
Awesome.
thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody else, for being here. And shameless plug as well. I'm going to be teaching at FDIC this fall as well. It'll be my first year. So come and
Nice.
heckle me.
You
It'll
too?
be fabulous.
Michael's there too, right?
We sure will.
All right. Thank you
Thank
all.
you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys. See you next time.